Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the 97 UX Things podcast. Dan Berlin here, your host and book editor. I'm joined this week by Erin Malone, who wrote the chapter Follow These Principles of Gestalt for Better UX. Welcome, Erin.
Hey, Dan. How are you?
All right. Thank you for joining the podcast. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and your UX journey?
Sure. I would say I got started in UX before it was UX. I was a print designer. I was working in advertising, and I decided to go back to grad school. And during the time I was in grad school, I discovered this thing called HyperCard, and I wanted to do my master's thesis in that tool because I had a variety of media. I had video, I had sound, I had I was doing it on a series of magazines. It was a design history piece, so I had the magazines and still images. I did a full library science cataloging of the magazines for the Cary Library. I went to grad school at Rochester Institute of Technology, and so I hacked together what would now be called a new media degree and took classes in the computer science department and in computer graphics department and the digital photography. And then I was in graphic design and sort of put this together. And while I was in school, I started working at Kodak doing some
Mm-hmm.
touchscreen kiosk work. And I ended up working there after graduation for almost 2 years and moved out to the Bay Area here in San Francisco, where I'm based, to work on Adobe's first website. And that was in 1995 when the dot-com boom was just barely getting started.
Yeah.
And we didn't know what we were doing. We were just designing things, throwing it up on the internet, getting feedback, making changes. There was no process. There was, it was sort of a free for all. And through that time, and then eventually moving to a startup and helping codify some of the kinds of processes that we do, and I'm a big one for making diagrams and maps and things like that to visualize how things work, and then just a lot of community engagement with peers to help define stuff. And so I've been working, I would say, in this space since about 92, and so that's a long time. And I've seen a lot of changes. I've seen it go from this sort of grassroots cowboy mentality to where folks are writing books about how things work and what people need to know. And there's now degrees and university degrees and master's programs in the space, and it's a real thing. It's a real field, and I've been lucky enough to be along for the ride and kind of helping shepherd it, and I'm still doing it.
What was it like getting buy-in to UX in 95 and
Oh
ensuring that it
gosh.
was implemented?
Well, when I was at Adobe, I was in a Marcom group, and the website essentially was brochureware to
Mm-hmm.
promote the application. So I wasn't working on applications. We were concerned with information architecture as opposed to the more robust interaction design, because it was really all about content. When
Yeah.
I moved to the startup, it was more interactive, and I was the first designer in an engineering group, and I just worked with those folks to, try things, and they would build them, and we would test. Well, we actually didn't do any user testing; that didn't exist yet.
Right.
We started that about a year after I had been working with this engineering team, and it came down to building relationships, which is really
Hmm.
what it still is. It's about
Always is.
building
Yeah.
relationships and building trust, so that people trust you and respect the qualifications and the experience you have, but they have to trust you in order to believe in that, and trust that, and that you know what you're doing, and that it's built on experience or testing or data, whatever. And if they don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really about those relationships. And it was tough because at one point we got bought, and the company that bought us, so we were an engineering driven organization with design embedded in engineering, and I had this group of folks that I worked with that really trusted me, and I've been working
Mm.
with them for 2 years. And then we got merged with two other companies, one that was marketing driven, so advertising, marketing driven, and the other was news outlet people. So it was editorial, and this was Alta Vista. So they bought, this was back in the like 99. CMGI bought us. They merged Alta Vista, the search engine, which was marketing driven because of paid search, with Zip2, which is where I was, which was engineering driven, and we were doing city guides, yellow pages, maps, directions, stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then they brought in folks from CBS Sports Center to create a newsroom. And so you have
Yeah.
these three cultures working together that absolutely did not work together.
Right.
And, the advertising side was like standing over our shoulder going, move this here, move this there, etc. And the Sports Center people are like, we got to get this out. We're on deadline, because they're used to, we've got to drop this and got to scoop all the other news people. And luckily, I was in the engineering group with engineers who trusted me, and they were
Mm-hmm.
like, we're not going to move this. Have you gotten this approved through Erin? And
Yep.
so I had a lot of support it was very frustrating for other people, but we had to do a lot of education for these other groups, because this was the beginning. Nobody knew what this was.
Yep.
Nobody knew why design and interaction design and user experience design mattered, because it wasn't seen as a differentiator yet.
Yep. You raise a great point about the need to build those relationships
Mhm.
over time so that you have the trust of of your fellow engineers and designers and researchers and everyone who makes this happen, because UX is necessarily a team sport.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Let's dig into your chapter. Follow these principles of Gestalt for better UX. Tell us about that, please.
Oh, awesome. I love Gestalt. So, Gestalt principles are often taught to graphic designers, but not necessarily folks practicing UX design. And Gestalt, if you want to look that up, the Oxford Language Dictionary defines it as an organized whole that's perceived as more than the sum of its parts. And it's a set of principles that were developed and codified by a group of different psychologists at the turn of the century. And they were looking at how perception affects how people understand the world around them. And so these principles essentially help us understand how people make meaning to the things that they are seeing. And so, as a designer, we can leverage that perceptual understanding and create more meaningful and useful experiences by taking a look at these different principles and applying them to our designs. And what that does is we leverage what's already happening in someone's brain, and how their eyes and their brain are interpreting what they're seeing, and we can leverage that in order to help people better understand what to do and how to work controls, how to understand the content that might be on a page that's grouped together. And that means we don't have to work as hard as designers trying to explain everything.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like that's the microcosm of UX for visual space perception. In UX, we're always trying to leverage the strengths of the brain and bolster the weaknesses. And what we're talking about here is specifically for that visual perception and leveraging our innate capabilities to uncover understanding and meaning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, people automatically group things together if they're close. And so we can simplify their need to have to deconstruct what something means by grouping things together that should be together. And we use these principles to infer affordances for how things work. And so it's not just the visual, it's also to help folks understand the workings. An example I like to share with my students, I teach interaction design history as well as visual design, is during World War II, there were a lot of plane crashes that happened, and they attributed a lot of those to pilot error. And there was a researcher who was looking into this named Alphonse Chapanis. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name. It's Chapanis. Seems French. And he basically showed that the pilot error could be reduced by redesigning the cockpit for a more intuitive design. And what he had seen was that the controls for the flaps and the landing gear looked exactly the same.
Hmm.
They were grouped together. They looked identical, and in the split second decisions, people were picking the wrong control and they were crashing. And so he changed the shape of the controls and the placement so that they no longer looked like they went together, they no longer looked the same, and that cut down on these crashes. And Paul Fitts, and a lot of us have heard of Fitts' law, and that notion that the smaller something is and the farther away it is from where you start, the less likely someone is going to be successful at selecting that thing. And Paul Fitts was doing similar research. And he was looking at if we organize and optimize the design by grouping things by type and meaning, and basically he's thinking about the Gestalt principles, then we could reduce errors. And you can apply this to controls in a user experience, to button groupings, to you think about settings, that's really full of all kinds of things that can be grouped. And by pulling these things together, we automatically tell people without words that they have similar meaning or they go together or have a similar action or interaction.
Yeah.
And it's there's a bunch of sub principles under this sort of larger principle around grouping. It's things like similarity. So if things are designed in a similar way, then we can infer that they will work in a similar way. If they are closer together, then we can infer that they have a similar meaning or a similar type of understanding. If things move all at the same time, we call that common fate. So like if you grab a bunch of things on your desktop and move them, we infer that they're all going to move in the same direction.
Yeah.
And things like that. So figure ground, things we use that a lot with pop-ups and modals and stuff like that, where parts of the screen are pushed back and other parts are brighter. And that is using the concept of figure ground. So there's all these visual principles in this Gestalt family that we can take advantage of when we're designing.
Are there ones that you see employed more than others, and that we're better at using, in our minds that we use more often?
I think similarity is one that either people really get or they totally don't get.
Hmm.
And I mean designers, not people, not general people, because I often see novice designers like using all different kinds of shapes of buttons and things like that, and different colors, and placing them in different places. And it's like, are these all intended to do the same thing? You click on it and something happens. Well, then they should be designed the same.
Yeah.
And I think proximity is probably the most powerful because it supports Fitts' law. And we've got things that are closer together that imply groupings. We see that in how toolbars are put together in all kinds of applications, and the things that are grouped together, there's an implicit understanding that they work in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's one that we use all the time, and
Yeah.
we don't even think about it. But if we think about what the principle is, and really that along with Fitts' law, then we can be smarter about the nuances of how these things are put together. And when something isn't right, like it stands out like a sore thumb, if it's something that should be in the grouping and it's off by itself, you're like, why is that over there? Or it does something different, and you're like, what? It causes a bit of cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm. Are there other examples where you've seen newer designers where there were opportunities to employ the Gestalt laws? Are there examples that you can convey?
I think there's one of the principles around symmetry and order. Like we like to organize things, we like the symmetry. That principle, coupled with good typography and readability and legibility, can work really well together. And I think that's an area where the design and the visual design that I'm seeing out in the world is not as strong as it could be. I hate centered text. I don't think blocks of type should be centered because it reduces legibility. It creates awkward and ugly white spaces, and it just violates that idea of symmetry and order. And why would you purposely design something to make it harder for people to read. It drives me crazy.
You and me both.
It's one of my pet peeves.
And it's more natural for our eye to go back to the same place where it was at the beginning of the line, not having to search for the beginning of the sentence.
Absolutely. And the thing is, people don't read whole words. They scan and they jump,
Yeah.
and you need a landing place. And if that landing place is continuing to move, it's frustrating and you slow someone down.
Yep.
People don't spend a lot of time on the web and on things anyway, but why would you make it harder? And, a headline, that's fine to be centered, but a block of text should never be centered, especially if it's in a column. That just really pushes out that dissonance. One of the things that I've been studying, I've been writing a book about women in the field, and I came across some work by a woman named Sharon Pogenpole, who is a longtime educator at Illinois Institute of Technology and then was at the Hong Kong University Interaction Design. And she had been working with another designer educator named Jin-Suk Kim, thinking about time in animation within the Gestalt principles, like closeness of time and similarity of motion and proximity of motion. There's not a lot written about it, but I really think given how robust our ability to do interactions and animations is, that's something that should be considered to be added to the suite of these principles from the early 20th century.
That's a great point. And also when you consider service design, right? There's a temporal aspect to service design where you do one thing and there's time passes and you may interact somewhere else. That's still Gestalt. There's still a connection there that you want the user to have.
Absolutely. I hadn't even thought about it for service design, but that is so true. That closeness of time and that immediacy of, if this happens, you want to follow up with this other thing that's related. And so you could use these principles in less physical, less tangible types of experiences.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time here, Erin. Was there anything else that you were hoping to convey here at the podcast?
I think everyone should double down and learn these principles. I'm a big pattern library person. One of the last principles that is in the suite of principles is this notion of past experience. People come to the thing that you've designed with past experiences, and you want to leverage that. And that's what the pattern libraries do as well, is leverage that communal learning across a suite of experiences and over time and support that. I think we would do well to have basics of Gestalt be taught to every single UX designer out there.
Agreed, 100%. It helps us set those expectations, which is the whole point of UX.
Yeah. And I think our visual design would get better along the way too.
Yeah. Great. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's been great chatting with you.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be able to talk about some of these ideas and concepts.
My guest today has been Erin Malone, who wrote the chapter Follow These Principles of Gestalt for Better UX. Thanks for listening, everyone. You've been listening to the 97 UX Things podcast, a companion to the book 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know, published by O'Reilly and available at your local bookshop. All book royalties go to UX nonprofits, as will any funds raised by this podcast. The theme music is Moisturize the Situation by Consider the Source. And I'm your host and book editor, Dan Berlin. Please remember to find the needs in your community and fill them with your best work. Thanks for listening.